This story is a work of historical horror fiction inspired by the late 18th century American frontier. While the setting, time period, and certain social conditions of Kentucky in 1798 are based on historical realities, the events, characters, and the so-called serial killer family are fictionalized. The intention of this narrative is to entertain and explore themes of isolation, fear, and human darkness within a horror storytelling framework. It does not represent actual families, places, or documented crimes, nor is it meant to disrespect the people of Kentucky or its history. All characters are products of imagination, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Reader discretion is advised due to graphic descriptions of violence, suspense, and psychological horror. By the autumn of 1798, a new family arrived in the rolling, forest-hemmed hills of central Kentucky. Their timing raised little suspicion at first. Families often came west after the harvest, seeking land that was cheaper than what could be found in Virginia or Pennsylvania. They were a quiet clan, keeping mostly to themselves as they settled on a patch of isolated ground along a wagon trail that few dared travel after dusk. Their farm seemed ordinary at a glance: a weathered cabin of hewn logs, a leaning barn with a rough stone foundation, a smokehouse, and a field that looked as though it had been cleared with great haste. The land bore the marks of violence against nature: trees hacked rather than cut cleanly, roots torn from the soil, stumps left jagged in the earth. To the casual eye, it was simply another struggling frontier farm. Yet to those who looked more closely, something about the new arrivals did not fit the rhythm of the frontier. The father was a tall man with shoulders like split logs, his hands always dirty, but his eyes carried a coldness that unsettled those who dared meet them. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were short and without warmth. The mother, thin and pale, kept her head lowered, her voice soft as if she feared being overheard. She carried herself with an almost religious severity, as though silence itself were her prayer. Their children, 2 sons nearly grown and 2 younger daughters, were strange in their own ways. The boys worked the fields and chopped wood, but they rarely spoke to neighbors, avoiding eye contact as if the outside world were a threat. The girls, no older than 12 or 14, could often be seen near the woods, watching passers-by with an unnerving stillness. More than once, a traveler later recalled feeling their gaze long after he had left the trail behind. The family introduced themselves only briefly when necessity forced them. They told the blacksmith in a nearby settlement that they had traveled from the east, though they gave no details about their origin or kin. No one remembered their surname with certainty, for each time it seemed to change slightly. One month they were called the Harpers, the next the Harns or the Hargers. It was as if they did not wish to be remembered too clearly. In the close-knit communities of frontier Kentucky, where family ties were often all a person had, this secrecy was troubling. Still, suspicion alone was not enough to condemn them, and in a land where people often disappeared on their way west, the newcomers blended into the silence of the wilderness. The farm's location gave it both seclusion and power. It stood at a bend in the trail that wound through thick woods, where the trees seemed to swallow the light even on bright afternoons. To the east stretched miles of unsettled land, and to the west the path led toward settlements, taverns, and river crossings. Many travelers moving westward were forced to pass this stretch, often weary from days of travel, sometimes desperate for food or a safe place to rest. That the family positioned themselves at such a crossroads was either cunning chance or calculated intent. Their farm became a beacon of supposed refuge in an unforgiving wilderness. At first, neighbors noticed small oddities. Smoke rose from the farm's chimneys at strange hours, long past midnight, carrying with it a smell that was not quite wood, not quite pork, not quite anything they could identify. When asked, the family claimed they smoked meat for winter or burned damp logs. Yet no one ever saw them at markets selling bacon, ham, or venison. Livestock pens seemed unusually empty, the fields poorly tended. Despite this, the family never appeared hungry, and they always seemed to have goods to barter: blankets, iron tools, trinkets, and sometimes even coins, though they rarely traveled to towns themselves. Their possessions seemed out of place for poor farmers, as though acquired from many different owners. Rumors began quietly. A peddler who had been seen headed down the trail never arrived at his intended stop. A young preacher who spoke of carrying the word westward was said to have vanished somewhere between two settlements. A trader's horse was later found grazing in the woods, its saddle empty, its reins tangled in low branches. Some whispered that the forest itself swallowed the unlucky, but others noticed how often these disappearances seemed to occur near the stretch of road where the family lived. Hospitality was both a duty and a danger in frontier Kentucky. Travelers often relied on strangers' generosity, for an inn might be 50 miles away. The family played this role well. More than one survivor told, years later, of being invited into their cabin when the night grew too dark to travel safely. A fire burned in the hearth, a table was set with rough bread and broth, and the daughters served in silence. Yet those who stayed longer than a single night sometimes noticed unsettling details. The way the father's eyes followed every movement, the unusual strength of the older son as he carried heavy timbers with unnatural ease, the way the mother whispered prayers under her breath not in English, but in some older tongue. Guests often felt they were being measured, weighed, and considered, as if the family decided whether they were to be treated as travelers or as something else. Still, proof of wrongdoing never surfaced. Those who passed the farm and lived to tell of it could not point to any crime committed in their presence. And so the whispers remained whispers, and the fear was left unspoken. It was not uncommon in those days for people to disappear. Wolves could drag a man from his camp, bandits could slit his throat, or he might fall ill and die nameless under a tree. But with each vanished soul, the suspicion around the farm grew stronger, like weeds creeping into the cracks of memory. Families traveling west began to avoid the trail when they could, choosing longer and more dangerous routes rather than risk the quiet farm by the woods. Yet some still ventured there, drawn by desperation or by the illusion of safety offered by firelight in the wilderness. Those who went and never returned became part of the growing legend. And those who survived carried an unease they could not explain, the memory of eyes in the dark, of doors that seemed to lock from the outside, of a silence that pressed in from the walls of that isolated home. It was in this way that the family wove themselves into the fabric of Kentucky's frontier terror, by standing in plain sight, their horror masked as ordinary life, their crimes hidden behind the simplest disguise, a cabin, a barn, and the trust of strangers who had nowhere else to turn. The farm itself was not what it first appeared to be. From a distance, it looked much like any other homestead on the Kentucky frontier, a log cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, a barn leaning against the weight of years, and patches of cleared earth trying to tame the wilderness. But up close, things did not fit the natural pattern of life. The fields were poorly tended, as though farming were only an afterthought. The fences stood half-finished in places, yet strong and fortified in others, as if they were not built to keep animals in, but to keep something out, or in. The barn smelled not of hay or cattle, but of damp earth and iron, a scent that clung to the air like rust. Inside the barn, neighbors who dared peek inside found it strangely empty. No cows, no horses, no goats, the very things a farm's survival depended on. Instead, tools were arranged in a manner too precise, blades sharpened not for daily work, but for something else entirely. Ropes hung from beams in knots that looked less like harnesses and more like restraints. Wooden crates stacked in corners gave off a faint odor that suggested rot hidden beneath a thin layer of straw. At times, muffled sounds were heard within the barn at night, rhythmic thuds or dragging noises that made the hair rise on the necks of those who passed by. When questioned, the family claimed they worked late to mend tools or butcher wild game. Yet, no hides were ever tanned, and no pelts were ever traded. The cabin itself told its own silent story. It was built with uncommon care for a frontier home, its logs tightly sealed, its shutters heavy and reinforced. The windows were small, allowing little view of the inside. Its front door was made of thick oak with iron hinges that seemed more suited for a fortress than a farmhouse. Visitors invited and often remarked on the gloom within, even in daylight. Curtains blocked out the sun, and candles burned constantly, filling the air with an oily smell. The hearth fire was always fed, yet the warmth never seemed to drive away the chill that clung to the place. The furniture was simple but sturdy, though some pieces bore scratches, as though clawed by desperate hands. Most unsettling was the cellar. Every homestead had one. It was necessary for storing food through long winters, but this cellar ran deeper than most. The trapdoor leading down was heavier than expected, its hinges greased so it opened without a sound. Those who glimpsed it described narrow steps vanishing into darkness, a smell of damp stone, and a draft of air that felt unnaturally cold. The family rarely allowed outsiders near it. Root storage, they would explain curtly, before quickly changing the subject. Some whispered that faint noises drifted up from the cellar at night. Muffled cries, chains clinking, or the hollow echo of something moving in the dark. Around the farm, the land carried its own unease. The soil seemed disturbed in strange patches, as though dug and refilled hastily. No crops grew in these spots, though weeds sprouted thick and fast. Travelers who camped near the farm swore they saw figures moving by lantern light late into the night, shapes that dug into the earth before vanishing again into the shadows of the barn. More than one hunter claimed that carrion birds gathered around the property, circling high in the sky by day and roosting nearby at night, as if drawn by a scent no one else could quite detect. Stranger still was the smokehouse. Normally used for preserving meat, it stood slightly apart from the cabin and barn, its door padlocked with iron. From within, a sharp and acrid smell leaked out, too strong for pork, too bitter for venison. Neighbors once asked if they might buy smoked meat, but the family refused, saying their supply was too little even for themselves. Yet the smokehouse's chimney never ceased to puff, season after season, as though something within required constant tending. The children, too, became part of the unsettling atmosphere. The daughters often played in silence near the edges of the woods, fashioning dolls out of sticks and bones. Their laughter was rare, but when it came, it was sharp and echoing, ill-timed and hollow. The sons patrolled the property like sentries, axes slung across their shoulders, watching the road more than the fields. Neighbors whispered that they never saw the boys sleep. Instead, they roamed the farm at night, lanterns in hand, their shadows moving across the trees like restless spirits. What unsettled travelers most, however, was the sense that the farm was waiting. Strangers passing by often described feeling watched, even when the family was not in sight. The woods around the property seemed unnaturally still, as though even animals avoided the place. A dog brought by a visitor once refused to step onto the property, growling and whining until it broke free of its leash and fled. The family laughed it off, saying frontier animals were often skittish. But to the traveler who owned the dog, the unease lingered long after he rode away. Over time, stories began to spread. A hunter claimed he followed a wounded deer into the woods near the farm, only to stumble upon a pit half filled with bones. Some looked animal, but others, longer, straighter, unmistakably human, lay among them. Frightened, he told no one at first, until whiskey loosened his tongue months later. A trapper swore he saw the family dragging something heavy into the barn beneath a tarp, and when he shouted a greeting, the patriarch offered only a cold stare until the trapper rode away. Others told of approaching the farm for water, only to be refused entry, the door slammed shut before they could explain their need. Still, the farm continued to stand, and the family continued their strange existence. The wilderness offered cover for secrets, and the lack of authority meant that whispers rarely turned into action. Each disappearance, each unsettling sight, added another layer to the legend, but without proof, nothing could be done. In a land where life was cheap and death common, suspicion alone carried little weight. What few could deny was the feeling the farm gave off, a sense that it was not a place of life, but of waiting death. Travelers who passed by too closely often quickened their pace, eyes fixed on the road, hearts thudding in their chests as they prayed not to be noticed. Those who lingered too long sometimes vanished into the silence of the trees, never to be seen again. The farm stood still, its chimneys smoking, its shutters drawn, its fields neglected, an ordinary place hiding extraordinary horrors beneath its roof and soil. In the years to come, those who lived to tell the tale would describe it not as a farm at all, but as a trap set in plain sight. A place where hospitality turned into captivity, where the ordinary disguises of frontier life masked the darkest appetites of humankind. And though no one yet dared name it aloud, the people who passed the property began to call it in hushed voices, the farm of horrors. Travelers moving along the trail near the farm began to vanish with unsettling regularity. Peddlers carrying goods westward, hunters returning from the woods, even whole families traveling by wagon seemed to disappear without leaving a trace. At first, neighbors blamed the wilderness, wolves, bandits, accidents, but patterns emerged. Belongings were sometimes found scattered near the farm, wagons abandoned, horses wandering riderless. Whispers turned darker. Guests who entered the family's cabin at night were never seen again. What began as coincidence hardened into fear, and the road by the farm gained a reputation. To pass there meant risking blood, silence, and disappearance. The first disappearance might have been overlooked. A lone peddler traveling westward, carrying pots and small goods, never reached the settlement where he was expected. In those days, such events were not uncommon. Highwaymen prowled the trails, wild animals claimed lives, rivers swallowed the careless. His absence was mourned, but it was not yet a matter of alarm. It was only when others began to vanish that the whispers turned into something colder, more sinister. Travelers spoke of the farm as both a place of refuge and of danger. On long journeys, a warm hearth could mean survival. The family understood this. Their cabin stood in just the right place along the trail, positioned as if waiting for the weary. Strangers were offered food, sometimes a bed, always with a kind of mechanical politeness. Yet once inside, the farm became a labyrinth from which some never returned. The family's methods were insidious. The patriarch would welcome travelers with slow, deliberate words, offering water or stew. The mother moved about silently, preparing meals, whispering prayers in that strange tongue under her breath. The daughters served bread, their hands pale and steady, eyes fixed on the guests with a stare too intense for children. The sons stood watch by the door, their presence intimidating rather than protective. For the unsuspecting, this felt like hospitality, albeit unnerving. For those who sensed danger, it was already too late. More than one survivor, those who escaped by chance or sheer luck, later claimed the family used subtle means to disarm their victims. Strong drink was offered in heavy mugs, its contents bitter, spiced with something that dulled the senses. A meal might leave a man sluggish, his limbs heavy, his thoughts fogged. The cabin's fire burned hot, making guests drowsy, while the family sat watching, patient as predators. When the moment came, it was swift, an axe from behind, a rope tightened around the throat, a knife slid across the darkened room. Few ever had time to scream. The bodies rarely remained where they fell. The barn, the cellar, the smokehouse, all became silent accomplices. Victims were dragged across the packed dirt floor, hidden beneath trapdoors, or carried out under the cover of night. The disturbed soil around the farm told its own story, though only the crows seemed willing to acknowledge it. Shallow graves were dug hastily, often reused, bones piled upon bones. Some corpses were stripped, their belongings kept to barter later, their clothes burned in hidden fires. Others were treated with a more ritualistic cruelty, though the reasons for this were never understood. As months passed, the tally of the missing grew. A preacher who had spoken of salvation, his hymns carried through the woods, vanished after resting at the farm. A pair of brothers driving cattle westward were last seen sharing supper at the family's table. A mother and child on their way to join kin disappeared between settlements, their wagon later found by a river, wheels broken, but no sign of struggle. Every story pointed in the same direction, yet none dared name it outright. To accuse a family was dangerous. Proof was required, and proof was buried deep in the soil of the farm. The trail itself became feared. Once busy with traders and settlers, it grew empty as word spread. Those who still braved it described a palpable dread as they neared the farm. The trees seemed thicker, the silence heavier. Travelers hurried their pace, glancing at the cabin with its shuttered windows and thin plume of smoke. Some swore they saw figures watching from the treeline, faces pale in the dusk. Horses grew restless, snorting and pawing the ground as though smelling blood. More than once, riders chose to camp in the open wilderness rather than risk knocking at the family's door. Yet for every cautious soul, there were others desperate enough to stop. Hunger, storm, or injury could force anyone to seek shelter. These were the ones most vulnerable, their need overriding instinct. And these were the ones who most often disappeared. stories began to filter into settlements, carried by those who had narrowly escaped. One man told of waking in the cellar, his head pounding, his hands bound. By some stroke of fortune, he loosened the ropes and fled through the dark, climbing up into the woods where he hid until dawn. Another spoke of hearing screams muffled through the barn walls at night, though he dared not investigate, leaving before first light. A woman claimed she saw bones, human bones, stacked in a pit near the smokehouse while the daughters watched her with silent amusement. These accounts were dismissed by some as drunken tales, but they spread nonetheless, feeding the legend that grew with each retelling. The community began to take notice. Neighbors whispered to one another, but spoke little in public. Fear of reprisal was strong. The family was known for their cold stares, their son's physical strength, the patriarch's intimidating presence. No one wished to draw their wrath. And so the disappearances were explained away: bandits, wolves, bad luck. To admit the truth was to admit that evil had taken root among them, disguised as kin, and this was harder to face than the wilderness itself. Still, signs could not be ignored. Hunters found clothing caught on branches, torn and stained, far from any trail. A child wandering near the farm discovered a traveler's satchel buried beneath leaves, filled with goods that should have been in another man's possession. A blacksmith recalled repairing a knife for the patriarch, only to recognize it later as belonging to a missing peddler. Each piece on its own was nothing, but together they painted a picture too grim to deny. The family thrived even as their neighbors struggled. Their farm produced little, yet they always had goods to trade. Their clothes were better than most could afford, their tools sharper, their stores full. They seemed immune to the hardships of frontier life, as though they had found some dark harvest unknown to others. Those who looked too closely were met with silence or threats, and so most chose to look away. By 1799, the trail near the farm was spoken of in hushed tones as cursed. Mothers warned their children not to wander near it. Travelers avoided it when they could, even if it meant adding days to their journey. And yet, the farm remained, its shutters drawn, its hearth burning, its soil swallowing secrets. It was not until the number of vanished souls became impossible to dismiss that the whispers turned to resolve. Something was happening on that farm, something monstrous. And while fear kept the truth buried for a time, the weight of blood would soon draw the attention of those unwilling to ignore it any longer. The trail of blood had grown too long, and the land itself seemed to cry out for reckoning. Behind the shutters of the cabin, the family's life followed a rhythm no neighbor fully understood. By day, they performed the motions of farming, chopping wood, tending to fences, clearing brush, but these tasks were always carried out with an air of pretense, as though they were done for appearances alone. The real work happened under cover of darkness. When the sun dipped behind the hills and the woods grew thick with shadow, the farm awoke in its true nature. Lanterns glowed in the barn. The smokehouse chimney choked with heavy fumes. The cellar door creaked open and closed long into the night. The patriarch ruled the family with iron certainty. His voice was rarely raised, yet his word was law. To his children, he was both father and commander, shaping them into instruments of his will. Some said he carried scars from wars fought back east, battles that had hardened him into something less than human. Others whispered he had once been a preacher or a man of standing, fallen into disgrace. Whatever his origin, he carried himself with authority, his eyes cold and appraising. When he looked at a traveler, it was not with the gaze of a neighbor, but with the calculating measure of a butcher examining livestock. The mother was the silent center of the household, her devotion not to love but to ritual. She kept to her prayers, muttering in it she believed, or perhaps convinced herself, that their acts were sanctified, offerings demanded by some greater power. To her, the killings were not simply murders, but sacrifices, a grim duty to ensure the family's survival. The neighbors saw only her downcast eyes and modest manner, but within the cabin, her influence ran deep, shaping her children into believers in this twisted faith. The sons bore the weight of violence most directly. Strong and silent, they carried out the physical work of the family's hidden life, hauling bodies, digging graves, sharpening blades. They rarely spoke to outsiders, and when they did, their words were flat, without warmth. To them, killing was not an act of cruelty but of routine, a task as ordinary as chopping wood. Yet, Beneath their hardened exteriors, something darker stirred. Some accounts suggested they took pleasure in the hunt, relishing the fear in their victims' eyes. Others believed they were simply broken by the life they had been forced to live, their humanity crushed under the father's rule. The daughters were the most unsettling of all. With their pale faces and watchful eyes, they embodied innocence corrupted. They played at the edges of the woods, fashioning dolls from bones and twigs, whispering games that made little sense to outsiders. To guests, they appeared quiet, obedient girls, serving food and clearing dishes without a word. Yet their silence was deliberate, their stares unblinking. Some survivors later recalled how the daughters seemed to study them, as though deciding whether they were fit for the family's dark purpose. There were rumors, too, that the girls lured victims, wandering the trail, pretending to be lost, drawing kind souls back to the farm where their fate awaited. Together, the family operated as one organism, each member playing a role in the cycle of deception, murder, and concealment. What bound them was not love but a shared belief in their mission, a pact sealed by blood and silence. Outsiders could never truly penetrate their world. To step across the threshold of their cabin was to enter a place where ordinary laws of kinship and morality no longer applied. At the heart of their secret lives was a strange duality. By day, they wore the mask of farmers, quiet, pious, hardworking. By night, they revealed their truest selves, predators cloaked in domestic disguise. Their farm was not a home but a stage set for death, a place where family bonds had twisted into something monstrous. Each vanished traveler, each buried body, was another thread in the web they spun, a web that bound them tighter together even as it darkened their souls. This was the world hidden behind the shutters of the farm, a family shaped not by the frontier's hardships, but by their own relentless hunger for power, control, and the silence of those who crossed their path. For years, the farm's secrets remained shrouded in silence, yet shadows cannot hide forever. The first cracks appeared when hunters and trappers began finding belongings deep in the woods, items too valuable to be abandoned. A rusted musket left leaning against a tree, a blood-stained bonnet snagged in branches, a torn boot, its sole worn smooth by miles of travel. These fragments might have been dismissed as signs of robbery or misfortune, but their frequency pointed toward something far more deliberate. Neighbors began to speak in whispers. Families noted that travelers who mentioned staying at the farm were seldom heard from again. Merchants who sold goods to the patriarch wondered how a farm so barren could produce enough wealth to barter with such regularity. Some claimed they saw the sons dragging heavy sacks toward the barn under moonlight, moving with urgency, as though afraid of being seen. Others swore they heard cries carried on the night wind, too faint to be certain, but unmistakably human. Still, fear kept suspicion quiet. To accuse the family outright was dangerous. They were strong, intimidating, and isolated enough to make retaliation swift and unseen. Yet unease grew. Some townsfolk avoided the trail entirely, preferring longer, harsher routes. Mothers warned their children to keep clear of the property, their voices trembling as though the land itself carried a curse. The first real challenge to the family came when a group of hunters stumbled upon a grisly discovery, a shallow pit in the woods, half filled with bones. Some were animal, yes, but others bore the unmistakable marks of humanity. A skull with a broken jaw, ribs gnawed yet too large to be deer. Terrified, the hunters told no one at first, fearing disbelief, or worse, the family's vengeance. But fear breeds rumors, and rumors spread faster than truth. Soon, tales of bones in the forest, screams in the night, and cursed ground traveled through every tavern and settlement within miles. The community began to watch the family more closely. When a merchant went missing after trading with them, eyebrows raised. When a preacher vanished along the same trail, people whispered of divine punishment. Yet still, no proof was enough to act. Kentucky in those days was not governed by courts and juries. It was governed by survival, and unless the threat came to one's own doorstep, most chose to remain silent. But silence cannot last forever. Each vanishing left another wound in the land, another soul unaccounted for, another secret clawing its way into daylight. The people's patience thinned, their fear curdled into anger. And though the family still moved in darkness, The eyes of the frontier had begun to turn toward them, watching, waiting, ready for the truth to tear through the veil of silence. It began not with courage, but with desperation. Too many had vanished, too many families left without answers. The hunters' grisly discovery of bones had rippled through the settlements like a sickness, and soon whispers turned to meetings behind closed doors. Fathers with missing sons, wives with absent husbands, merchants robbed of their kin, all shared the same suspicion. At the center of every story, like a shadow that could no longer be ignored, stood the isolated farm. By late autumn, a group of men gathered, farmers, hunters, and a few lawmen from a nearby settlement. They came armed with muskets, pistols, axes, and torches. The plan was simple: confront the family, search the property, and put to rest the rumors once and for all. But beneath their resolve lingered fear, for each man knew the family's reputation. They were strong, cunning, and dangerous, and the land itself seemed to protect them. The raid began at night, under a moon veiled by clouds. The group approached the farm in silence, their boots crunching softly on frost-hardened soil. The cabin loomed ahead, its shutters drawn, a faint orange glow flickering through the cracks. Smoke coiled from the chimney, carrying with it the same foul odor neighbors had whispered about for years. In the barn, shadows moved, lantern light swaying as if someone worked long after midnight. The men fanned out, surrounding the property. A shout broke the silence. "Come out!" The patriarch stepped into the doorway of the cabin, axe in hand, his eyes gleaming with cold fury. Behind him, his sons emerged from the barn, weapons ready, their faces carved with defiance. The mother clutched a lantern, her lips moving in strange prayers, while the daughters hovered like ghosts at her side. What followed was chaos. Gunfire cracked, smoke filled the air, and the screams of men and beasts alike tore through the night. One of the sons fell to a musket ball, but not before splitting a farmer's skull with his axe. The other fought like a man possessed, dragging a hunter to the ground before being overwhelmed. The patriarch swung with brutal strength, his blade clanging against musket barrels, his roar echoing across the fields. It took 3 men to bring him down, and even then he fought until blood soaked the earth beneath him. When the smoke cleared, the cabin was breached. What the men found inside froze their blood. Chains bolted to the cellar walls, piles of bones stacked in corners, bloodstains soaked deep into the floorboards. In the smokehouse, human remains hung where pork should have been. The truth was no longer rumor. It was a nightmare laid bare. The family, those who survived, were dragged from their home, bound in iron, their silence heavier than screams. The farm itself seemed to groan under the weight of its revelations, its walls steeped in years of hidden terror. For the men who raided it, nothing would ever be the same. They had not just uncovered murder. They had unearthed evil, born and nurtured within the heart of Kentucky's wilderness. The raid ended the family's reign, but their shadow lingered long after their bodies were buried or their names erased. In the weeks that followed, the farm stood abandoned, its windows shattered, its doors torn from their hinges. Neighbors avoided the land as though it were cursed. Travelers crossed themselves when passing by, muttering prayers for protection. The soil, once tilled in pretense of farming, lay scarred with shallow graves and pits filled with bone fragments, silent testimonies to the horrors concealed for years. The surviving members of the family were taken in chains to the nearest town, where justice in those days was swift and unforgiving. There was no lengthy trial, no deliberation. The evidence, the bones, the chains, the blood-soaked cellar, spoke louder than any witness could. Accounts differ on their fate. Some say they were hanged before a crowd, their bodies left as warnings against sin and cruelty. Others claim vigilantes stormed the jail and exacted their own vengeance in the dead of night. Whatever the truth, none of them walked free again. Yet their story did not end with their deaths. It seeped into the folklore of Kentucky, told in hushed voices around campfires and whispered in taverns to frighten travelers. Parents warned their children to beware of lonely roads and strange families offering shelter. Hunters swore they still heard screams on the wind when they passed near the old farmstead. Some even claimed to see pale figures at dusk, the daughters wandering the woods as if still searching for their prey. The legacy of the Farm of Horrors was more than just a tale of murder. It became a symbol of the darkness that could take root in the wilderness. On the frontier, where law was thin and survival harsh, people realized how easy it was for monsters to wear human faces. The family had been neighbors, traders, farmers in appearance, yet behind closed doors they had created a kingdom of death. That revelation shook the settlers' faith in community and in the thin line of trust that bound strangers together in such a wild land. Even as years passed and the farm decayed into ruin, the legend grew. Writers, preachers, and storytellers carried the tale beyond Kentucky, turning it into a warning of human corruption. Some embellished it with talk of witchcraft, curses, or demonic bargains. Others used it as a sermon on sin, greed, and the dangers of forsaking morality. What remained constant, however, was the undeniable truth. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of lives had been swallowed by that patch of land, their blood soaking into the roots of its soil. 3.